Welcome to everyone who is here in person and to those who are attending online to this year's Pacific Migration Workshop hosted by the Development Policy Centre. This is our fourth Pacific Migration Workshop. It's normally run in beautiful Fiji as part of the Pacific Update, but this year we are not holding the update. It's being held again next year. So we are doing the Migration Workshop here in Canberra. And I want to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, whose lands were never ceded. I extend my respect to elders, past, present and emerging, and to those who are in the room. Also, as a New Zealander, I'd like to say kia ora ana tātou katoa and a warm Pacific greetings to everyone who is here. And thank you in advance to our presenters who are willing to share their research today, and especially to those who have travelled to be here for the workshop. And I'd like to thank our panel chairs as well, as they have made themselves available to assist with today's event. We're very grateful to have your input. And finally, a big thanks to Finn and Aloha and Amita for all their help in organising today's workshop, ensuring that it runs smoothly. We've got a full programme, starting with a session on Pacific climate immobilities and resilience, followed by presentations on economic and social dimensions of migration, before we finish the day looking at some new developments in low-skilled temporary migration and broadening the focus beyond the Pacific. The programme is tight, so presentations are to be kept to 15 minutes. We've got a laptop here that will be counting down and that will, presumably goes off, it makes some sort of sound at 15 minutes. And if you keep going, then the panel chairs will intervene and try to keep you to time. And given we've got such a tight time frame, I'm going to move straight on to introducing Professor Stephen Howes, who is going to give the opening address. Stephen is a Professor of Economics at the Crawford School of Public Policy here at ANU, and the Director of the Development Policy Centre. He is an expert in aid and migration in the Pacific region with a strong interest in both temporary and permanent pathways from Pacific countries to Australia. He's currently a member of the advisory group appointed by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme. And Stephen is going to give us an update on Pacific migration emerging trends and issues, and he's going to do some housekeeping for me.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. And thanks to Charlotte as well for all the work she's done. She's really pulled this workshop together. It is a research workshop, so it's just an opportunity to share ideas and meet people who are working in similar areas and have similar interests. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I know we've got some distinguished guests, including Carly Shalita from Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Assistant Secretary for Labour Mobility, and others from the High Commissions. So thank you all for coming, and please enjoy the day. Yeah, there aren't that many housekeeping announcements. So the toilets are outside, and the wireless details are up on the wall. And if you have any issues, please come and let me know, or one of our staff know, and we'll help you. But yeah, before we get to the research, I just wanted to sort of set the scene for. Let me also welcome everyone online. Well, this is just remember, bear in mind, this is a dual delivery workshop, and you should have as many people have registered online as in person. So thank you for joining online, and please do participate in the discussion as well. Yeah, I just want to give you some sort of background and where I think things are going. So I've called this From Pacific Labour Mobility to Pacific Migration. So if we look at the last 2 decades, I mean, these dates are probably too precise, but it's just like that, roughly the last 20 years, I can call this the era of Pacific labour mobility. And it is quite remarkable. This is a graph that Richard has done, and Richard Curtin. And this is the proportion of the total population of these countries who are in 2022-23 were overseas at some point, either in Australia or New Zealand, working in one of the labour mobility schemes, either the PALM, short-term or long-term, or the RSE. And for Tonga, it's 14% of all adults. This is all sort of working age adults, right, age 20 to 54. Vanuatu 12, Samoa 8, Tuvalu 6, Kiribati 3. The others are smaller. But it's quite amazing, you know, if you had told, say, Vanuatu or Tonga that, you know, we're going to develop a new scheme and in the next 10 to 20 years, 10 to 15% of their adults are going to be working on this scheme and they're actually going to be earning an Australian or New Zealand wage. Okay? I mean, you wouldn't have believed it, right? It would sound like a scam, right? So it's quite remarkable that it's a sort of transformation, at least for those countries at the top of this graph. And there's certainly no other sort of group of countries like this, where they've got so immersed in seasonal and short-term temporary migration. So not to say that these schemes are without problems, but just the size of it, right? It's an enormous achievement. It's probably the biggest thing that's happened if you think about the economics of the Pacific over the last decade. So that's the era of Pacific labour mobility, and I'm sure, you know, because it is so important, it will continue to be researched and debated, and it should be in the coming years, as it has been over the last 20 years. But my take is now that we're moving into a new era, which includes this temporary mobility, but goes beyond it. And you could call this the era of Pacific free or freer movement. And this is not a new thing, right? There are long traditions, but if you look at kind of recent policy developments that have shifted us in this direction, you know, what are the important ones? So I think a key thing was this new Pacific engagement visa that Australia decided on back in 2022. You know, it's just now being rolled out. It's not totally new for the region, right? New Zealand has a similar visa that Australia's copied, but it's very significant. It's 3,000 visas. It's a very different approach for Australia. It's permanent residency. So it's a completely different approach to the temporary labour mobility scheme. So I think that has sort of decisively shifted the trajectory in this area. And then last year we had the Philippine Union, you know, which again is totally unprecedented for Australia. You know, New Zealand has some similar arrangements, but unprecedented for Australia, and gives you know, Tuvalu, not all Tuvaluans immediate permanent residency, but you know, over the next 10 years or so, you know, or 20, they're all going to end up with permanent residency in Australia, and it's a residency they can't lose once they've got it. So that's very significant. And then, oh, that's a typo. It should be 2023, 2024. But you know, we had some prominent Pacific leaders sort of calling, you know, that this free movement idea, you know, is one that they supported, that the region needed to act on, that Australia and New Zealand need to act on. You know, first of all, we had Samoa make this call. You know, this is the prime ministerial level, then Fiji, and then Solomon Islands. And then just this year, the Pacific Islands Forum, you know, got on board this idea. And you know, it's always you know, confused or disappointed me, I guess, that there was so much emphasis on the blue Pacific, you know, this oceanic continent, but not really on the people moving across the ocean. But that changed. It changed just you know, last month, right, when the new Forum Secretary General made this statement at the opening of the Pacific Island Forum Economic Ministers meeting. He said we must advocate for freer movement of people within the islands, including Australia and New Zealand, to facilitate greater regional economic cooperation and integration. So that's a very good statement. You know, first of all, talk about freer, not free. So it's quite realistic, pragmatic. So it's focused on Australia and New Zealand. That's where the interest is. And it is part, you know, everyone agrees about cooperation and integration, and no one's going to disagree with that. So I think that's the correct framing for this approach. So that was very positive, and I know the Forum Economic Ministers meeting discussed this idea, although where they got to is a little unclear. But it did actually make it to the leaders' meeting. I mean, it's a rather odd statement. I know people have focused on the whole China-Taiwan snafu, but this is another snafu, I think, because this is the very last point, number 75 in the communique. And it says, leaders recognise the importance of connectivity across the Pacific to build people-to-people links, and leaders welcomed efforts to improve access and mobility opportunities throughout the region for forum leaders and officials. So that's like free movement for us. So I don't know how that got negotiated, what the background story is for that, but I guess it's kind of good news. It's the first time this idea of free movement's made it onto the leaders' communicate. So even if it's, not particularly ambitious language, at least it's on the agenda and it's a starting point for the future. So what is free movement? I think it's quite a general idea, which is sort of good, but also can confuse people. So it's really got two quite distinct meanings when people use it. People use it in very different ways. Some people use it to mean sort of easy travel. So this is travel without requiring a visa. You can get a visa on arrival, or you have good access to multiple entry visas. So you get a visa every 5 years, and after that you can travel. Or you can get electronic visas. So it's just making travel easier. That's kind of the less ambitious, but still, important meaning. And then the other one is what, you might call open migration, where you can only travel to a country, but you can stay for as long as you want. It's not like a 3-month or 3-week visa. You stay for as long as you want and you can work there. You've got work rights. So this is more like permanent or indefinite residency. So both these meanings are incorporated within the idea of free movement. And I just want to stress, it's not it can sound very utopian, but it's not a utopian idea at all. So even within the Pacific, we do see free movement in both senses. So we know that New Zealand and Australia, and then, it's often forgotten, but also Cook Islands, Tokelau, Niue, they already enjoy full freedom of movement. So that's, 4 members of the forum, and Tokelau is an associate member. They already have this, very full freedom of movement. And then you have other pockets of freedom of movement where FSM Palau and RMI enjoy unrestricted migration rights to the US. Of course, New Caledonia, French Polynesia, and France enjoy full freedom of movement amongst themselves. And then on the easy travel, most Pacific countries have this visa on arrival arrangement, though not Australia and New Zealand, although they do it for each other and for the Cook Islands, Tokelau, Niue. So, we see it in the Pacific. It's a matter of how can we spread it further. And then I also want to stress it's not a utopian idea globally. We often think we're in an era of hardening borders, national security, negative attitudes to migration. But if you look around the world, I found this very nice little summary of all the sort of migration blocks, some of which I'd never heard of. Of course, we all know about the European Union, right? But beyond the European Union, there's CARICOM, which is in the Caribbean area. Not all the countries, but 12. And then Mercosur is 9 countries in Latin America. And, that's a very good example, I think, because there's not full movement, but you can move for 2 years and you can work for 2 years. And, that's a good period within which you can find a job. You can get a job, then you can apply to stay longer. So we do see this idea around the world. In fact, this recent survey says that regional agreements facilitating mobility have proliferated and now involve around 120 countries, either at a bilateral or multilateral level. And then close to home, if you think about ASEAN, ASEAN is a very kind of weak union, very different to the EU. But even there, they've gone down the easy travel route, and they all provide, or almost all provide, visa-free travel for each other for this, limited period for these short trips. And this would look very different for the Pacific. It would, for most of the Pacific countries, the island countries, smaller countries allow each other basically a visa-free policy, but Australia and New Zealand has a very different policy. Yeah. So what are the reforms that could take us in this direction of free or freer travel? So, these are some of the ideas that have actually come about, or that, we've started to be discussed, and some of which we've advocated for. APEC has this business travel card, which is a 5-year multiple entry visa. And I have one, and it's really good for traveling to PNG. And that's something the Pacific Islands Forum could introduce for the Pacific. And that would make, and it's not just businesses and private sector, right? It's more like executives, right? Could be government leaders, NGOs, as well as business executives. Australia's actually introduced something called the Pacific Australia Card, which is kind of, as I understand it, it's a sort of informal Pacific business travel card for Australia. And it kind of gives you sort of multiple entry visa over a long period, but it's a very informal arrangement. You can't find any information about it. You can't apply for it. You have to be invited, offered it. And that's something, that could also be formalized, made a specific visa category. There is a lot of pressure on Australia to move in this direction, and Australia has made commitments and is implementing those commitments to reduce processing time for visas. So when you do have to apply for a visa, at least you can, you probably have to wait longer. And then, as you might have known, New Zealand has now removed the transit visa requirement for Fijians traveling through New Zealand. So that's a good, practical example of making travel in the region easier. And then on the second interpretation of free movement, sort of open migration, what could be done there? Yeah, so I definitely think New Zealand needs to rethink its Pacific access category. It can't really be called a Pacific access category if it's only for Fiji, Tuvalu, Samoa, Kiribati, Tonga. Yeah, so what about Melanesia? So I think that's something I hope New Zealand will reconsider. Australia's introduced the PEV, but Natasha, yeah, it's had this good idea, just like New Zealand has the Samoa quote, Samoa stands apart from the Pacific access category. Australia should think about some special arrangement for PNG, as our major former colony that we historically discriminated against through the White Australia policy. With the 50th anniversary of PNG's independence coming up next year, I think it'd be a very appropriate time to introduce a PNG specific permanent residency visa. Then, with the Tuvalu agreement, is that something that other countries are interested in? Of course, it's up to them to step forward, but you can imagine countries like Nauru or Kiribati might be interested. It won't be exactly the same because, of course, Tuvalu doesn't recognize People's Republic of China. The other countries do, but that's something that would really push this agenda forward. And then I mentioned this Trans-Tasman travel arrangement, which includes New Zealand, Australia, and then Cook Islands, Papua New Guinea. And can that be expanded? It's a very long-standing agreement, goes right back to 1973. And could we just think about expanding that on a bilateral basis? Like, what about Fiji? Fiji is a country that has a large diaspora in both Australia and New Zealand, and could be a candidate for expansion of the Trans-Tasman travel arrangement. And then finally on process, I think if these ideas are going to take off, you need to think about what's the process that's going to push them forward. Blogs can only achieve so much. So this is where the forum needs to really step up. It's good, now this idea is on the forum agenda, right? We've seen that this year. So I think a start's been made, but as I said, it's not really clear where it's ended up, and there's that little paragraph in the communique it's not a very auspicious sort of beginning. So, what I've said is that either at the FEM, the Economic Ministers meeting, or at the leaders meeting, the forum should come together and agree to this as a goal, free or freer movement as an aspiration. You don't need to put a timeline on it, but as something that we aspire to as a family. And then once you have that as an aspiration, then every year countries can report on what they're doing to bring us closer to that, to bring us closer to that aspiration. So I think that's the process that is needed to propel this forward. And then finally, what are the implications, I guess, for us as the sort of research community? Yeah, so our research agenda needs to expand beyond Pacific labour mobility, look at Pacific migration. Also, Pacific labour mobility will remain central, but it's not the only issue, not the only important issue. So we need more studies of the Pacific diaspora in Australia and New Zealand. We need studies of emigration, trends, drivers' impacts. Of course, we can debate whether it's a good thing. I'm certainly, as you can tell, I'm biased in favour of it. I guess most economists would be. This is knocking down barriers, reducing barriers to trade. It's got to be a good thing. But of course, that could also be debated. And then, as new mechanisms and schemes are introduced, as we see happening, they need to be evaluated to see how they're performing and how they're improved. But having said that, if you look at the agenda for today, you'll see this kind of mix. A lot of the presentations are focused on labour mobility, on the New Zealand and Australian schemes, but we also see presentations going beyond that looking at the diaspora here in Australia, Pacific diaspora in Australia, looking at the out-migration from Fiji, it's been so common in the last couple of years. Yeah, so I think we're definitely moving in this direction, but I think it is it's a good thing. It's a sign of the times and the way of the future. So thank you very much. I'll end my presentation there.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Interesting to see in your slide on the clusters, you've got the northern Pacific countries with access to US, the eastern Pacific countries to access to New Zealand, but it's the western Pacific. Yeah, it's got, at this stage, it's got no real access apart from the Melanesian Spearhead Group. Those are the countries that, yeah, presumably you're particularly thinking about.
Yeah. Some Fiji, I mean, it varies from country to country. Fiji, countries find, some countries find their own ways, even with limited formal arrangements. But yeah, it's sort of Fiji, Solomons, Vanuatu, and I guess the least migration opportunities in the past. Yeah, that's under the open migration, under the ease of travel. I think all countries still want to see action on that front.
Any questions for Stephen?
Thank you. One issue is that there's going to be downsides and there's going to be reactions against it, particularly on efforts like the Pacific Engagement Visa, particularly with the loss of skilled workers. I think it's going to be important that there be a sophisticated research agenda that collects administrative data from the application process and verifies it, codes it according to classifications such as the International Standard Occupational Classification System, to be able to monitor it over time, because otherwise you can't let a system, as we saw with seasonal work, simply develop over time without feedback loops in the system.
Yes, so I think, when I talked about research, looking at the trends, drivers, impacts, yeah, overall, I think it's got to be a good thing, reduce barriers to travel and to move. But yeah, it's not like there are no negative impacts, or that we know opposition, and and also look at look at brain drain issues, look at brain gain issues, what are the incentives, and then look at how the people fare when they're in Australia. How do they come here on the PEV? Do they have to have a job, but do they stay in the job? Do they lose the job? How does their family fare? Yeah, I think that's the sort of research that we definitely hope to do in the, we've got this specific labour mobility survey that we've been working on with the World Bank. See Zoom here, and Ryan. Yeah, I think in the second phase of that, we're definitely hoping to go beyond looking at the labour mobility schemes, but also look at the impact of the PEV. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Sandra Go from Flinders University, and I just started to do research on the Pacific migration. I have a question. I'm an immigration lawyer, so from more legal perspective, can you tell a little bit about the regional system in this area? Because we do have the Australia visa program and New Zealand, and so do we have some formal regional kind of possible to have a treaty, regional treaty, not to exactly go to the EU, that level maybe at this stage, but anything about this regional kind of mechanism at this moment? Thank you very much.
Right, thank you. Well, no, there are sub-regional agreements. So I mentioned the one with Australia and New Zealand, Cook Islands, Niue Tokelau. And you know, I could have mentioned other, I mean, there is the Melanesian Spearhead Group, which does allow or encourage skilled freedom of skilled migration. It doesn't really, it's not working. I think that's my understanding of it. There's hardly any migration actually occurring under the Melanesian Spearhead Group, but it is there. But so there are sub-regional initiatives, but there's no regional approach. That's what I'm saying. It's only this year it's really come onto the regional agenda. You know, I mean, it's interesting why it hasn't come onto the regional agenda before, given the emphasis on the Blue Pacific. And perhaps because, you know, some countries have had so much freedom of movement, you know, that they can move to Australia anytime, or you know, or even if it's not unlimited, it's generous sort of visa arrangements. So that whereas other countries, you know, say PNG, they've had very limited access. So Pacific is such a diverse region on migration. So perhaps that's why it's taken a long time to view this through a regional lens. But you know, I do highlight what's happened this year with the Secretary General. I mean, he is the region's most powerful bureaucrat, and if you've got his support, you know, then things should start to happen. So I think we're at the start of that process rather than anywhere near the end. Charlotte, fine.
Hello, Susan Love from the Parliamentary Library. Thanks, Stephen. Just following on from your statements there, I wonder how much Australia's initiatives have actually sparked this Pacific Islands Forum lean into the migration statements, or how much has, what's the back and forth been there? Is Australia's announcements of the Pacific Engagement Visa and the Tuvalu arrangement been sort of a catalytic in this respect, or has it been a bit more of a bottom-up approach as well? What are the threads there that you can see? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's not, I don't have a very clear answer. I think labour mobility itself, right, has generated more discussion. It's just put migration more on the table, but both in a positive and a negative way. I think one reason why countries are still a bit hesitant about this free movement, because actually Sardana, who works with us, was at the FEM and interviewed some of their leaders, and you can see there's kind of general support for freedom of movement, but also hesitancy, because they are still grappling with labour mobility. Like that first graph I showed, there's such a huge shock, right? Such a big change. I think countries are still absorbing that. And so they're a bit reluctant to sort of open up a whole new front. I think that's a reality. That's why it's probably, you know, it's not going to go really quickly. It's going to be a gradual movement. So yeah, it's engendered some hesitancy, but also more interest. That would be one reason. Yeah, it's also, yeah, I think I don't really have a good answer as to why it's sort of come onto the agenda now. Perhaps a variety of different factors. Yeah, which labour mobility is one.
Thank you, Stephen. We're going to leave it there and keep moving. Thank you.